Location services in cellular networks, known as LCS, are actually a very involved procedure. It's not as simple as just the device grabbing its own GPS coordinates and providing them to whatever application. It's actually more complicated because the network has a lot of involvement and there's a lot of techniques and technologies that actually get utilized. So in this session, we're going to consider just some of the concepts behind location services. We'll talk about the different kinds of location services that are available, the standardization of location services, and finally the requirements of the network. So for a particular kind of location service, what level of accuracy do we actually need to provide? So as you might expect, cellular location services are actually standardized by the 3GPP. And in their high-level Stage 1 documentation, they've actually broadly categorized location services into four main areas, which you can see on screen. So just to explain what those four main areas are. First of all, we've got commercial location services. And this is when a location services client of some description is there to provide a value-added service to the user or the subscriber. So more often than not, this will require permission from the subscriber for a location service to be actually applied to that subscriber's device. But generally speaking, it's for the benefit of that subscriber. So location service data will be gathered and shared as appropriate, maybe shared with the subscriber or shared with some kind of third party to provide commercial assistance of some description. We've also got internal location services, and this is where the subscriber isn't really exposed to that location services data. Now that said, they will still potentially have to provide permission that location data can be gathered on them. But the internal location services is to do with the inner working of the network. It might be, for example, to enhance handover services. It might be related to traffic usage in the network, identifying hotspots. It could be related to coverage and checking whether or not coverage is good enough in a given area. Maybe operations maintenance tasking, intelligent networking services, or maybe teleservices. So this is internal to the network. Possibly the most common use of location services is to support emergency services. So when you make an emergency call in whatever country you may be in, that call will be handled by a call handler, and it's the job of the call handler to get the emergency services to your location. Now the problem is, if you are in distress and you can't talk to the call handler for whatever reason, there must be an automated way to get your location. So location services are critical in that respect. Depending on where you are in the world, the level of accuracy applied to that location can differ quite considerably. And then kind of associated with emergency services, but specifically for the police and the security services, we've got provision for lawful intercept as well. So this is when we have a warrant to actually track the location of a specific target device. So as mentioned, those are the high-level categories, and you might find that in your own country, the only location services that you see are actually related to emergency services. You might not see many commercial location service applications being used. Now, we're not talking specifically about apps on a phone here. We'll come back to that momentarily. Now, what we can do is just elaborate a little bit further on this and look at specific use case scenarios for location services. So just delving into this a little bit deeper. So for example, we can have public safety services in general. So that's not just emergency services, what we just mentioned. It's also the widely used emergency alert system. So in whatever country you may be in, you will have potentially an emergency alert service which could tell you when heavy rainfall is expected, whether or not we are expecting a tsunami, earthquake, volcano, or maybe even a terrorist attack of some description. So public safety services can benefit from LCS, as can location-based charging services. So based on your specific location, based on a specific zone that you might be in, whether it's in the home, the office, a particular area of recreation, you can be billed differently, but we need your location to resolve that. We've got the likes of tracking services which are commercially used on a relatively wide basis. It's very common to see things like fleet or vehicle tracking, but we've also got the likes of asset tracking where devices have got small cellular chips on them so that we can track their location. We could even have tracking of an individual's location or that particular individual's pet, which is actually quite an attractive service for pet owners. We've got the likes of enhanced call routing to often assist the user in some way. So it might be call routing to the closest service client. It might be some kind of emergency roadside assistance that can be provided. We've got information services which are location based. So it might be related to navigation services in a vehicle. It could be related to city sightseeing and tourism, maybe local broadcasts or indeed route finding. And then finally, we've got the more internal side of things, which is network enhancing services, whether it's network planning, whether it's optimizing the network through QoS improvements. We've also got radio resource management, and various aspects of radio resource management can benefit from location services. So hopefully you've got the message that there's actually a wide array of different opportunities to use location services in cellular networks. But I will just reiterate that it really does depend on where you are in the world as to what level of services might be available. Now, one final point, you might think, that why do we actually need these location services? Because my device has got GPS on it. Now, what you find is a lot of apps that you have on your device today will just directly use GPS on your phone without any involvement from the network. So as long as you provide authorization for that application to use your location, which I'm sure you've done plenty of times, then we can just directly access that GPS information. What we've got to remember is it's not as straightforward as that, because every device that we talk about on a given cellular network is not necessarily a smart device with GPS coordinates. Take cellular IoT, for example, which is becoming increasingly popular. With cellular IoT, the devices are often made as cheaply as possible, and that means that if we don't need GPS in the device, well, we won't provision the device with it, we'll make it cheaper. But that doesn't mean to say that the location of these devices doesn't need to be tracked in some way, shape or form. So cellular location services are very, very important for the likes of cellular IoT, where we can use different techniques beyond GPS to actually resolve the location of that device. So when we talk about location services, it's not just about GPS on that device. There's a lot of other different techniques that can be used to resolve location. And across all of the generations of cellular technology, they all use those different techniques in different ways, and we'll talk about that later on in the training course. As you may imagine, it's the third generation partnership project that is behind standardization of LCS within cellular networks, and they have released a variety of different specifications, some of which are quite generic and some of which are technology specific. Now, this is really a reference for you to understand which specifications are actually out there for further study, and I guess the starting point is 22.071, because this is the stage 1 high-level description for location services, and it is quite generic. It's not specific to any particular technology. We then start looking at the stage 2 documentation, so the more detailed documentation which isn't specifically related to protocols and which protocols get used in the network, but it is more accurate in terms of signaling flows and such like related to how LCS actually works. Now again, this is relatively generic, is 23.271. What we can actually get are several different specifications which are technology specific. So for example, for GRAN, our 2G technologies, we've got 43.059. So that's our stage 2 description for GRAN. We've got the same for UMTS or 3G. We've also got the same for 4G. So you can see they're all standardized in separate 3GPP specs. For 5G, again, we've got a stage 2 description for 5G. We've actually got two. We've got one for positioning within NG-RAN because 5G, as we'll see later on, does add some additional techniques that can be used. But we've also got the overall location services stage 2 documentation. And then finally, just as an example, we do have some quite specific specifications for different location services techniques that can be used. So for example, universal geographic area description is just a technique which is used to define a geographical area related to coordinates and shapes and things like that. But that's just one example, and there are plenty of others to go into the details of the likes of OT, DOA and such like. So that's just a brief outline of the various specifications, and as we go through the training, when we start getting a bit more specific on protocols, we'll provide some additional information on specifications there. The final part of this session is just to consider the capabilities and actually more crucially some of the requirements from the network for delivery of location accuracy for different applications and use cases. So what we've got on screen here is the device, and on the other side is the location services client. This is the entity that could be looking for the location of the device. For example, very commonly, it might be a public safety answering point associated with emergency services calling, or it could be some kind of application server delivering a value-add service. So it's the cellular network, the combination of the core network and the radio access network that is there to provide that location data. Now, one point to note is, although location data, as in geographical coordinates, is the main objective here, it's worth being aware that there is other data that we might be interested in for our service. For example, we might be wanting to find out about the actual velocity of the device. So that's a parameter also associated with location services. We may also be looking for general time of day information for the device, and all three of these could actually be used together as appropriate. And then finally, it's very useful to find the estimated error or the level of uncertainty on this particular data. So there is a little bit of a margin of error depending on specifically which location finding technique has been used. So moving on, let's just have a consideration of a few different use cases and the actual level of accuracy that we need. So how good can our location services actually be? So for example, for asset location, route guidance, navigation, that kind of category, we've got an accuracy of 10 to 50 meters in the horizontal plane. The next one you can see is related to emergency calls, but this is emergency calls in the USA, where the Federal Communications Commission have stipulated quite stringent guidelines as to how accurate the information must be. So it extends to a particular apartment within a particular floor of an apartment block or perhaps a skyscraper. And you can see that targets were laid down that 80% of calls by 2023 must have this level of accuracy location information available when the call's made. And you can see in terms of that accuracy, in the horizontal plane, it's around about 50 meters. In the vertical plane, it's 3 meters. So as we go through, we've got the likes of localized advertising, home zone pricing, network maintenance, information services, network demand monitoring, etc. So that kind of accuracy, 75 to about 125 meters horizontally. We've got rural and suburban emergency services. Now, this doesn't relate to the USA, so we might find this in other parts of the world. Things like manpower planning and information services. You can see that level of accuracy is a lot wider, so 500 meters to a kilometer, which for emergency services could be quite concerning because it's actually not that accurate. So if we do have somebody in distress, we might not be able to pinpoint that location. It depends on the country of operation. The likes of vehicle asset management, congestion avoidance advice, well, that's about up to 1 kilometre. Local news and traffic reports, that can be a bit wider, so we're talking 20 kilometres. And then even things like weather or localised weather warnings, perhaps traffic warnings for a longer trip. Again, you can see that that's a much wider area of coverage in terms of 200 kilometres location accuracy. So you do get quite a significant variance, which could actually define what kind of location finding technique ends up being used in the network. I will say that in 5G, techniques have been introduced to make the level of accuracy much more accurate. We're talking about potentially within 10 centimeters of accuracy, but very specialist techniques have got to be used in the 5G network to achieve that. So it's not something that maybe a smartphone would benefit from. It might be something like an automated guided vehicle on a factory floor, for example. So variations in requirements, but it's all really about what capabilities we have in terms of our location services.